Hi everyone, my name is Ali Cullerton. I'm coming to you today from Loja, Ecuador, the Centro Ecuatoriano Norteamericano Global Quality English. And today we're going to be speaking about effective strategies for English language learners. By English language learners, I might use the term ELLs, and when I say that, I'm referring to a group of students who speak a language other than English as the native language, but are currently learning English. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to switch off the video in just 1 second and switch over to our PowerPoint. Before I did that, I just wanted to make sure that you all were able to see where it says charla, preguntas y respuestas. Go ahead and any questions you have there, type them in and I'll be able to see them while this webinar is going on. And there's also a poll in that area, and on the very bottom you'll see a section that says related links. The related links has 6 videos that I would encourage you to watch after maybe the webinar is finished, and it just will give you some more examples about what we're talking about today. So thank you so much for joining, and I'm going to switch off my video here and get on with the webinar. Okay, great. The presentation isn't going to last too long today. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk at the end. I think that interaction is really one of the best ways for us to learn. I don't want to just sit here and give a lecture, so I will speak for quite a while, but throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please type them. If I can multitask, I'll try to answer questions. And again, there'll be plenty of times for a dialogue at the end. In the presentation today, we're going to define and discuss the themes of discourse, oral language and speaking, reading, writing, and listening. And then we're going to come up with different strategies that you can use to support language learners in each area. In order to start this conversation, we need to begin by talking about literacy development and why it's different for English language learners. So when I'm talking about literacy development and how it's different than maybe language development in the first language, it's very specific, it's very different. A native language is a process that's very authentic. There's a lot of language modeling, there's a lot of listening that happens for young learners of a native language. Whereas for learners that are learning an additional language, it's much more complicated. It's not as authentic. The actual development process is quite different, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. And again, when I use this term literacy, I'm using it in a very big way. I'm thinking about literacy in a way that includes not just reading and writing, but also speaking and listening and the effect of culture on literacy as well. So once we understand the factors that affect this development, we can understand or have a better idea of what will work to help their students. One of the factors includes the position on the path to literacy. And when I say this, I'm really asking about, do your students read? How long have they been in a school? What is the quality of their school? What are their experiences with education up until this point? So I can give you a little anecdote here for me in particular. I've been asking my students that are learning English to write essays for me lately. And I was really unimpressed and unhappy with what I was getting back from them. And I thought it had something to do with what we were doing in class. And after working with them for a few weeks, I have a better understanding now, just on writing, that these were practices that were lacking in the native language. So it would have been really helpful for me to know that in advance. And so I encourage you guys all to ask those sorts of questions of your students, because I feel personally like I wasted some time with these students. If I had been better prepared and understood where they were, I would have been able to meet their needs a little bit better. Secondly, we're talking about motivation. Why are they here? What is the personal incentive to succeed? Is it work? Is it school? Is it travel? Think about the mission of your program and how that shapes your lesson planning and the student objectives. So students need some sort of incentive to succeed. This is an innate thing, right? So when we have personal motivation to achieve a goal, we are much more likely to achieve that goal. Third, vocabulary. So again, prior educational background, where are they starting? Do they know a lot of casual words but struggle with pronunciation? Do they have pretty good informal vocabulary but struggle with academic language? Are they getting great grades and getting A's on all their vocabulary tests but really struggling to speak in the classroom? And lastly, context. Again, is this a private school? Is it a scholarship program? I'm going to encourage all of you to try to identify both the mission of your program as well as the individual classes that you teach to help strengthen your overall approach to education. Discourse includes how and why language is used in the classroom. We ask how do our values shape language in the classroom and what type of language is happening. So when we speak about discourse, it's a question not only about language, but it's really that intersection of written or spoken language with the social context again. So this idea of what our classrooms look like, what is the mission of our program, it really does influence the development and the approach to education. Some discourse adaptations that we can use in the classroom to affect English language learners are on this slide. And you may have seen in one of the questions for the polls was all about discourse adaptations. The question was something like, are you using discourse adaptations daily to make your language more accessible to your students? And one of the ways classroom teachers create access to content learning for English language learners is by modifying their speech to provide a greater amount of what we call comprehensible input. So to do this, we modify speed, we modify complexity and syntax to provide oral language that is more comprehensible for our students. Many of you already do this automatically on your own as teachers, just as good educators. Yet it's good to remind ourselves of why we're doing it and the benefits it has for our English language learners. So first is pretty obvious, frontally facing learners while giving directions rather than doing so with their backs towards the class. When we do this, our students are able to read our lips, they can pay attention. Secondly, we want to use the same words and phrases repeatedly rather than use a variety of different expressions. So this may be confusing because learning synonyms and antonyms is a really great practice for vocabulary, but in the initial stages when we can develop these sorts of routines where we know very clearly that it takes repetition for students to understand a word. So if we develop a routine with repetition, then the student learns the word. From there, we can go and do synonyms for the word, right? Next is employing gestures and intonation to convey key concepts or words. So as teachers, a lot of us probably feel like we are dancers and singers and actors all at the same time. So we do have to be quite theatrical to keep the attention of our students. So I'm not suggesting that you get up on a table and do a tap dance or anything like that, but it is important to be a little bit more animated when you're in front of the classroom, particularly with learners of a new language. Next is writing and visual supports to oral speech. Now, if any of you have children of your own or you've ever worked with young children, you know that for them, the meaning of a story lies in the illustrations, right? So that's why we see these beautiful illustrations in children's literature. Rarely will you see a toddler ignoring the pictures and instead looking at the words. And this is a perfect example of why literacy development for English language learners is so different in the second language, right? So if there's something we can do to mediate that gap, whether it be have some posters available or include pictures to go along with our vocabulary or introduce graphic novels into the classroom, those visual supports really do support oral speech. Lastly is just paraphrasing and restating. Again, it helps, and this is paraphrasing and restating what you say, but also what your students say, right? So when your student says something and you're able to repeat it in a way that's a little bit more clear, it not only helps clarify the proper way to say it, but it helps keeps others engaged. I'm going to switch over to the thing here and see if I have any questions yet. Okay, so I'm checking the charla preguntas y respuestas. I don't see any questions yet, but do feel free to, I'll keep my eye on it, do feel free to write questions right in there. So we're on to scaffolding, and many of you already know about scaffolding. It's really how we break a lesson or a unit down into smaller parts so that the objectives are accessible to all of the students in your classroom. Scaffolding are just what we use to build something up, and we remove them as they're needed. As the students begin to understand the concepts, the scaffolds start to come down. There are numerous scaffolds we can use with speaking and listening for English language learners. Teachers of all children employ scaffolding techniques in the classroom as a routine. It's a matter of good practice. But particular techniques are essential to support ELLs. So scaffolding practices activate students' background knowledge, they engage them in learning through pairing or grouping, and they initiate independent work only after a model or guide has been provided. These practices have been linked to student learning, right? So this first one we see here says activating schema. And really all that means is activating background knowledge. What do your students already know about this, and how can we tap into that? Second, we have these options of a think, pair, share, which involves a little bit of independent work, and then partner work, and then of course group work. Or the turn and talk, which is a very simple partner work. And these build oral language use, and they also help with processing time on tasks. Next, we have this use of I do, we do, you do modeling or demonstrations prior to student work period. One of the videos that I supplied as an additional link is all about modeling. It's all about the I do, we do, you do modeling. And so I would encourage you to watch that after the webinar. But all it is really you introduce something, then you do it with your students, and then eventually you ask your students to do it on their own. But you would never ask your students to do something new on their own right from the beginning. Next, we have the provision of keywords, pictures, or sentence frames to support student work. And again, sentence frames is another video that I've provided for you on the links on this webinar. And lastly, summarizing or reviewing key learning points or principles. And I know this may sound redundant, but again, this idea of repetition with English language learners is incredibly important. And we've seen that it's one of the skills that really helps learners acquire a new language. It supports our call for discourse adaptations. It relies heavily on this notion of repetition. Next, we're going to move on to culture. So culture can refer to many different parts of one's identity, including ethnicity, race, nationality, sexual orientation, gender, age, hobbies, interests, and disabilities. I would like to ask you all to think for a moment about how your definition of culture changes when you look at it in this very macro lens way versus with a more smaller micro lens. So an example of looking at culture with a macro lens is by looking at culture and thinking of something like ethnicity. Whereas a way to think about culture with a micro lens is to think about somebody's hobby, right? So once we identify the difference between macro and micro cultures, we can also begin the discussion of how it might be dangerous that thinking of a macro lens of culture actually will provide us with enough information to understand the needs of a particular groups of students. Culture and language learning go hand in hand. In many language classes, teachers are asked to be ambassadors of culture and to provide intercultural exchange in addition to teaching language. This is a great responsibility, and it's important to be mindful of how culture is portrayed in the classroom. So some tips for general cultural responsiveness include understanding group practices as well as individual student variations. This kind of goes along with what we were just talking about, the macro versus the micro cultures. Secondly, use of textbooks and bulletin boards and classroom materials that avoid stereotypical representations. One of the poll questions I asked you was, do you have a classroom library, and is it diverse, right? Next, being aware of linguistic and cultural bias in testing instruments. So when you use an assessment, think about where was this assessment created? Who is it created for? Will there be questions or certain jargon or certain language that's used in this test that my students will not be able to understand just because of where they live geographically, right? I'm going to check in here and make sure everything's running smoothly. Okay. Okay, let's continue on. Next is providing opportunities to develop reading skills by selecting stories that will be culturally proximal to the learner. So I can give you a very specific anecdote here. I come from Chicago, Illinois, and being there, I went through the classrooms. I was asked to go through classrooms and look at the libraries, right? And what I found was that in a primarily maybe 95% African American school, a lot of the books in the library had white protagonists. And that was a big problem, right? The students should be able to read stories about people that look like them. And lastly, recognition that bilingual students use both languages to learn. So I do say they use both languages to learn, and I do believe that's very important. At the same time, I want you all to be very aware and very comfortable with this notion that English should be the dominant language in an English language classroom. So if you are an English language instructor and you don't feel very comfortable speaking, there's some things that you can do to practice, right? You can watch movies, you can watch TV in English, you can listen to more music in English, but also there are tons of online conversation platforms now where you can get on Skype and you can practice speaking with a native speaker or with other English speakers, English teachers throughout the world that maybe speak English as a second or a third or even a fourth language. Text selection and reading. Why is text selection important? Should text be at, above, or below ability level for ELLs? Do you have diverse genres of text in your classroom? By genres, I'm just talking about, do you have some picture books? Do you have some novels? Do you have some poetry? Do you have some graphic novels, right? Different types of books. Do you have a classroom library? Do you give students time to read in class? And can they borrow books to read at home? I'm going to pause on this slide for a moment. There are, let's see, 6 questions here. And I would like for you to take a moment to try to identify one question and to go ahead and respond to the question in the preguntas y respuestas section. So I'm gonna be silent for about 30 seconds here, and I'm gonna ask you guys to go ahead and send in some questions. Okay, so I see questions coming in now. How do we manage and teach students with different English levels in the same class? That's a very good question, and that is something that we will talk about in just a second. So whoever wrote that question, I think it was Invitado 7800, you asked how to manage and teach students with different English level in the same class. I want you to pay close attention when we talk about differentiation in about 5 or 10 minutes, because we'll get right on that. Christian would like to know how he can teach English or practice his English by using Skype. That's something that when the webinar is over, I will go ahead and send in a bunch of links of different conversational platforms that you can use. Some of them are free, some of them you subscribe to. Okay, great. Okay, so I don't see questions coming in yet about text selection and reading. I will go ahead and respond to one of the questions here. I asked, should text be at or above or below ability level for English language learners? And my answer to that is going to be, it should be all, right? And it really depends on the task. So if you are asking your students to read independently at home, it should probably be at their level, or maybe even if they're not a really motivated reader, a little bit below their level, just so they can start getting into this practice of reading. However, when you are helping mediate the text, when you're the one reading the text, or if you're doing group work or in-class work, I would always recommend that the text actually be at above the level of where your students are at. Great, we're going to move on to the next slide, but I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for any questions on text selection and reading. And if I see any, I'll go ahead and respond to them. For now, let's move into print modifications and reading. So when the reading material is unmodified, the teacher may still offer support to English language learners by either providing an enlarged text that is read aloud, which supports, particularly for those students in Asia, left to right directionality, right? And a model for how these words are pronounced. It also allows us to set up structures for paired reading with a fluent reader. I would always encourage your group work to be multiple levels, not just all the same level. And lastly, to provide audio taped versions of the text. There is, at the very end of the webinar today, I'm going to share my personal website with you, which is alexiscullerton.com. And on there, I have a page all about book lists. And I mean, there's probably 30 book lists up there that a lot of them are for English language learners, and they span from the ages of preschool up until college level. So if you're looking for new books to bring into the classroom, that might be a good place to start. Additional print modifications include an abridged or adapted version of the text, including a word bank either prior to reading or along with the reading, rewriting the text at the student's level, adding visuals to the text. So again, I'm a big fan of graphic novels, and I use them a ton with my English language learners, and I have had such good experiences with this. In fact, in the spring, I'll be doing another webinar all about book clubs, and we'll talk a lot more about graphic novels then. But my last point there is to use the graphic novel version of a text. A lot of people don't realize that you can get any classic novel in a graphic novel format. So even something as difficult as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is available in a graphic novel format. Okay, still not seeing any questions, so I'll keep going. Now we're going to talk about language in the classroom. So before we talked about discourse in the classroom, which included language and context. And now we're just talking about language. So it's not discourse. The focus is on the actual oral language that is present. So I'm actually concerned that too many English language courses are heavily reliant on text, and we're really overlooking the role of oral language. This is something that I came across again with my students here in Ecuador, that my students were getting good grades, they knew a ton of vocabulary, but when it came to just having a conversation with me, they really struggled. So I realized that was a reflection of me not providing enough opportunities for oral language in the classroom. One thing I've started doing to help build oral language in the classroom is I kind of do this game with my students every so often. We'll get out a timer, and it's one of those days where they don't really need to do homework, but I could assign them homework if I want to. And I tell them, listen, if you can talk about the theme of the day, whether we're learning about the solar system or, you know, they were learning about their styles of learning a couple days ago, I'll time you for 5 minutes. And if you can sustain a conversation without any breaks, with every single person participating for 5 minutes on this topic, you will not have any homework. And over the course of working together, we're now up to 15-minute conversations. So every day I would say, okay, now 6 minutes, now 7 minutes, now 8 minutes. And I also totally step back. I don't interrupt them at all or make any corrections at all when they are speaking. I set my timer, I step back, I tell all of them that they all have to participate. I keep participant points of who's talking, and I just let them go. And for me, that 10 or 15 minutes of them practicing speaking to one another is way more important than that worksheet I was going to send home with them. So this is something that I've really enjoyed using in my classroom. Other ways that you can think about language in the classroom is by, are you using language to debate? Are you using it to express oneself? Are you using it to repeat things, to pronounce things, to summarize? Is it informal or is it formal language? Is it conversational language? And all of these questions are important because depending on your purpose for using language, your lessons are going to change. Okay, I see a couple questions coming in now. I'm going to pause and read them real quick. How can I teach reading if my students don't want to learn? I mean, they are not motivated. Okay, so motivation has a lot to do with why the students are there in the first place. And I would say it'd be really important to talk to your students about their purposes for being there. Are they there because their parents are making them? Are they there because they want to be there? And then try to meet them in the middle. If you need them to write an essay, have them write an essay on something they're already interested in. If you're asking them to read a book, go to the library and find a book for them on something that they're interested in, right? So, and again, this comes from whether I'm working with English speakers or English language learners. This is something that I've seen across the board, particularly with my work with adolescents. If we open up the opportunity for them to have some choice in the lessons, they're going to have a lot more motivation to learn. I see another question here. When should students be taught academic skills in reading, such as skimming, scanning, and summarizing? When should students be taught academic skills? Okay, so I don't know if that's necessarily you need to do one thing first and the next thing second and the next thing third. I think that those are skills that are developed in the native language. So again, look at this child's native language literacy abilities, and are they doing those things in the native language? If they're doing those things in the native language, they will automatically carry those skills over to the second language. So say your students speak Spanish. If they're really good summarizers and good scanners and good skimmers in Spanish, they're going to do the same in English regardless. You're actually not even going to have to teach them. You may want to be explicit and talk about it a little bit, but those are just some of those natural skills that will carry over. I see another question. How important is it to repeat a text after you read it in your own words? And I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is it's very important, right? How many of you have asked a student to read something out loud and they've done a beautiful job, but then taken the extra second to say, okay, now explain what happened, and then you just see their faces go blank? This happens not just because of learning a new language, but this also happens because reading comprehension skills are very low for a lot of teenagers. So even in the native language that happens. I could be reading something in English and I could read it beautifully, but then I could stop and you could ask me what just happened and I could not have an answer for you. So to answer your question, I think it's very important, and I think you're hitting on a notion that goes above language here, and you're really talking about reading comprehension. If that's something that you're struggling with in your class, that your students are struggling with, which is a very common challenge, I would suggest that you look up literacy strategies. And there's a lot of places you can just Google literacy strategies and see what comes up and start to use some of those strategies while you're reading. Okay, we're going to get back to language production now. So academic language is really the goal, but it's an additional challenge. And as we know, real life talking isn't academic language, right? The way that I speak to my friends or my colleagues isn't very academic. The way I'll speak maybe in a presentation or in front of my students may change a bit. But language is really changing throughout the day. Although when we are in the classroom, the goal is academic language. So these are some of the things we can do. And again, this isn't just an academic language, this is on real life, informal conversational talk as well. So students must express their learning through these academic discussions and maybe essays or some other sort of product or artifact or worksheet, which are linguistically demanding. So in the production skills of speaking and writing, English language teachers can support language development by doing these following things. They can provide response formats appropriate to the learner's oral proficiency level. So rather than just having everything be extended response, maybe start with simple yes or no. And then as they learn a little bit more, go on to either or. And then go on to short answer, and then go on to an extended response. Now, this doesn't always correlate with age, right? We may have some young learners that have been speaking English for a long time, so they may be ready to do a short answer right away. But I would say beginners of the language are going to start with more of the yes-no formats and move on from there. Secondly, we want to prepare students for participation in class discussion by pre-assigning roles, scripts, questions, or set phrases. This also touches on that idea of maybe motivation or participation. This is something that I love, that I do all of the time. So have you guys ever been in a classroom and asked your students a question and just stood there and waited and waited and waited and waited for them to respond, and eventually you just have to call on someone or you just kind of beg them to respond, and that's just really takes away from the learning environment, right? So one thing that I do is I maybe write a question or I write a word or a short paragraph on a note card. And as my students are walking into the class, I give them each a note card and I say, hey, at some point today, I'm going to call on you and I want you to read your note card, right? This does two things. It increases motivation because they don't really have the choice to not participate. But it also, a lot of the reasons that our students aren't participating in class isn't because they don't care, it's because they lack the confidence to participate. So if they have that extra 10 minutes to practice reading something before they have to read it in front of their peers, that's going to make them feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more willing to be active participants in the classroom. The next thing we can do to support language production, and remember, language production and the development of language is really different in a second language or a third language than it is in the native language. We don't start, when we start learning our native language, we start with little pieces of words, right? And then we string them together into larger sentences. But we're really asking our English language learners to speak in sentences from the beginning. So that would be like asking a newborn, to respond to you, which just doesn't make any sense. We can support emerging writers with techniques like the language experience approach, which allows the learners to express their ideas orally with the scribe recording their speech. So again, this can touch on oral language skills, and also allows us to have maybe a partner or a friend work on their listening skills while also writing down what they're hearing. And the last is a vocabulary notebook. I really suggest having vocabulary notebooks. This is something that you can go and buy the really, really small little flip pads and just ask them to keep them with them all the time. So, and one of the things too is we want to model how it is that we learn a language. So every time that a new vocab word is come across that they don't understand, pause and say, write it down in your vocabulary notebook. Write it down in your vocabulary notebook. Don't give them the answers right away. Tell them, write it down, write it down, write it down. And then allow them, give them about 10 minutes at the end of class every day just to pull out the dictionaries and look up any words that they missed that day and to talk about the vocabulary words. Again, we would hope that our students would do something like that on their own, but they won't. So they need for it to be modeled first before they begin to do those sorts of practices on their own. I'm going to respond to a couple more questions now. Give me a second. More activities to motivate our English classes, please. Okay, I'm happy to do that. Let's go through the webinar, and there's a lot of activities in here, and then also on the links that I'll provide. Okay. And so someone also responded that I answered the poll and all of my questions, all my answers were no. So how can I identify the specific roles and use discourse adaptations? Sorry, maybe I've already answered, but I have some internet problems. No worries. So I did actually talk about discourse adaptations at the beginning of this webinar, and I know the webinar will be available for you to download and for you to look at. The PowerPoint will after the webinar is over. So for you who's asking that question about discourse adaptations, that's at the beginning of the PowerPoint, and go ahead and look over the PowerPoint, and hopefully that will help you answer your question. Now we're going to go on to differentiation, and I remember someone asked a question earlier about different levels in the classroom and how we can work with that. Okay, so differentiation is how a teacher adjusts the activities and/or the responsibilities for an individual student based on their needs without adjusting the overall objective of the lesson. This is particularly beneficial for classrooms with a wide range of ability levels. Some things we can do that include differentiation to support our English language learners are content adaptations, learner support, and writing. Okay, so in content adaptations, we can provide a shorter text for some students, depending on their ability. We can provide more visuals for some students than others. We could also offer more simple text on a parallel text on the same topic. That's one of these adaptations that I use the most often. So say I'm teaching a lesson on the environment, and we're specifically talking about recycling or something. I'll find 3 different articles on recycling at 3 different ability levels, and when I ask my students to read and to provide some sort of written response to me about their reading, I assign them their article depending on where they're at in their native language and also where they're at in the second language. Because again, in order for our students to succeed, we have to meet them where they are. It's super important. Next is learner support. So we have to get away from what we call that IRE model, which is just initiate and respond and evaluate, where I just ask a question, they respond, and then we move on, right? That's really boring, and it's also very antiquated. So the more that we can incorporate group work and partners and allow the use of the dictionary and glossary or notes, because again, in real life, if you have a question with a word, you're going to look it up on your phone or in the dictionary or in the glossary. So if we can emulate the real world in our classroom, that's going to help our students reach success in the real world as well. Last is writing. Instead of making all of your students write a full essay, maybe some of them write 1 paragraph. Maybe some of them write 2. Maybe some of them write 3, and so on and so forth. You can change the amount of statements that they have to write from 5 to 10. Or you can even allow them to do some sort of comic strip or an attempt at a chapter of a graphic novel so that they can showcase how they're making sense of the concepts of the language in illustrations rather than writing. Again, writing is something that's really important, but understanding the concept of the language can also be assessed by having your students illustrate it. Okay, so that is through, we've gotten through our entire presentation now, and I went through that purposely a little bit quickly so that we could open the floor for discussions. So I'm going to ask you now, what will this look like in your own classroom, right? What are some things you can change based on what we've been speaking about? What are some things that you can change about the listening practices that are happening, or the speaking practices, or the reading, or the writing, or the differentiation for working with students at different levels? So I'm just going to stand by here, and I am going to be available for all of your questions. So please start sending in your questions now. And thank you again for joining me today. It's really wonderful to have you all here with me. Okay, I have a question about differentiation. How can we connect all of the levels in a class through activities that involve all of the students so they do not feel afraid of the students who have a higher level? That's a really good question, and that's from Diana. So again, I think it's important that our students do work with other peers that are at, above, and below their level. But you don't want to embarrass your students at the same time. So something you can do is if you're sending home, for example, 3 different levels of an article to your students, the other students don't have to know that, right? So you could say, here's your homework, read this, and then what they have to respond could be the same. So you could ask all of them, hey, I just want you to write a summary of what you read, and I want you to come tomorrow to class prepared to talk about recycling. And so then you would collect the readings as well as their response. So the other peers don't even see that they were reading different things. And you open up for a group discussion. So everyone's still able to add something to the group discussion on the theme of recycling, regardless of the actual recycling article that they read. I have another question here for an essay format for teens, please. That is something that I do have, essay formats for teens. I'm going to be giving another presentation on writing in a couple months that I could send that along. But in the meantime, I could send some resources as well. So you'll just have to contact all of these questions in terms of things that you guys want, like the Skype connection for conversation, as well as this essay formats. I will find a way, I'll speak with the people at the State Department, and we'll be able to share that information with you when you're done. Okay, so I feel that they get lost when the listening is too fast. So how can I help? So I'm not sure if this question refers to them listening to like something that's pre-recorded or not. But I mean, an obvious thing that you can do to stop, and you probably know this already, is just by going a little bit slower. Another thing that I think a lot of English language learners have a tendency to do is they get really hung up on one word that they don't understand. So say I'm speaking for an entire minute, and in that minute, in the first 10 seconds, I say a word that you don't understand, and then all of a sudden there's a sort of block in your mind. And rather than listening to the rest of my sentence, you're just trying to figure out that one word. By the time you realize that you're not going to understand that word, I'm already at the end of the minute, right? So that's one thing to think about. I see another question here. Someone asked earlier, and I'm curious as well, do you have specific suggestions for teaching college level and adult students? Yeah, so all of the things I'm talking about today apply to adult students as well. And in fact, I've used many of these strategies with advanced learners in the college level and also adults as well, international students in conversational classes at universities. Again, so it's not so much the level, it's more the development of language and the acquisition of language. So today's conversation is really about just the strategies we can do to make reading, writing, listening, and speaking more effective regardless of the level of the student. So just as much as these can be applied to older readers and older learners, these could also be applied to toddlers, a lot of them. I have a question here. Is it important that students read and write in order to be prepared to speak? And the answer is yes. That when we're talking about literacy and we're talking about language, it really, again, includes reading, writing, speaking, and listening. I'm going to turn my video back on here so I can respond to you in a little bit more of a personal way. I think you could see me. Hello. So yeah, I would say, Rosemary, the answer to that is yes, it's very important that they are able to do all of those things. And again, that's one of my concerns based on some of the observations I've been doing in this country, but also just my experience in the United States in English language learner classes as well, as I think we're relying a little bit too much on lecture and teacher talk and reading and writing than we are in oral language. So our students really need to build that up and feel a little bit more comfortable with having an actual conversation in the new language. Will I please send those links you mentioned that I provide English learning on Skype? Yes, I will. I will send those at the end when I send all of the other stuff as well. How can I avoid that students with a high English level feel bored in class because 90% of their mates have a low language level? So for your question, that's a very common thing, is regardless of if we're teaching English as a language or if we're teaching math or science, there's always going to be different levels of learners and knowledge in the same classroom. And so I would look at the differentiation strategies that I provided you with today, but then I would also Google differentiation strategies and look them up online. Some of the sites that I like a lot are ncte.org, which is the National Council for Teachers of English.org. I also really like the website readwritethink.org. I also use the teaching channel a lot, which in all the videos that I included as additional links. Again, a lot of these questions will be answered in those videos because you'll actually be able to see teachers using these strategies in the classroom. But all those videos come from the teaching channel. So that's another thing. You can go to the teaching channel and you can just search for differentiation, and you'll see a ton of videos there of what you can do in your classroom to help. So I have a question here. Should I tell my basic 2 students to read out the text instead of telling them to read in silence? So, you know, I would. I would say that reading in silence is a skill that's better attributed to at homework or independent reading. I think that while we have the context of you there to mediate the text, that yes, we should have students be reading out loud or reading in partners or reading in small groups. Can I give an example of how to scaffold a lesson? Sure. So let me go back to my PowerPoint here. Actually, I'll keep on the video. I've got my PowerPoint notes here. So scaffolding, and you guys know the word scaffolding just comes from, like, when people are building a building, there's construction crews there, right? And they have to build those weird ladders and things to stand on, which are called scaffolds, in order to reach, to make the building higher and higher and higher and higher. And once they've reached the completion of their building, they take all the scaffolds down because it's there on its own. So a way to do scaffolding in the classroom is, again, there's this entire slide there that talks about asking more about their background knowledge. So there's a lot of, you know, prompts that you can do, or conversations you can do, or activity starters you can do at the beginning of the class to assess where they're at. You could also focus on the we do section of the I do, we do, you do modeling. So for scaffolding, again, you would never want to start with just asking your students to do it. You would always do it for them first, and then you would spend a lot of time doing it together, and then maybe ask them to do a homework assignment on it. But then don't stop there. When they're done with their homework, bring it back the next day, and then do a we do again, where we talk about what problems they had with it, what questions they had with that. And so for me, that I do, we do, you do, we do cycle is really important. And there is a video on that you can watch at the end of this. How do I motivate students to like English? It depends on why they're learning English. So some students are learning English because their parents are making them to, and for them it's a lot more difficult. For the students that are learning English because they understand that learning this language will help them either with their career or with their school, when they have a personal incentive to build their English language, you're already starting in a much easier way. There's a lot of things you can do. I like to build personal connections with my students. I like to ask them what they like. I like to try to find ways to incorporate social media or music or little YouTube videos into the lesson to keep them paying attention, keep them engaged. I also like to give them choice in our lessons. So I will give them the option, for example, of, hey, you guys can talk about this for 10 minutes. If you can do that, you won't have homework. And then they always choose to talk for 10 minutes. And it really forces them to get outside of their comfort level and to talk just because they don't want the homework, which is fine by me because, again, hearing them speak is much more important to me than having some worksheet to grade, right? So I believe that was the last question. We have 10 more minutes, and I can actually take some more questions if you would like. I will stand by for more questions. While I do that, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint again. Oh, I think I accidentally closed it. Never mind. The PowerPoint is available on your screen, but on the very end of the PowerPoint, if you flip through, you will see additional resources, which includes where you can find the archived webinar in case you want to rewatch this, or also my website, which is alexiscullerton.com, as well as the Centro Ecuatoriano Norteamericano Global Quality English website, which is bncloha.org. So it looks like there are no more questions. I would like to thank you most sincerely for joining us today, and I would encourage you to watch all those videos at the end. Best of luck. You guys are doing important work, and I hope that this helped you a little bit, make your work a little bit easier. Take care. Thanks so much.